Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the last meeting in 2019 of the New York ARSC local chapter for this season. And tonight we are going to look into the art of Henri Temianka, virtuoso violinist, conductor, author, and educator, as presented by one of our more illustrious members of ARSC, John Haley. I'm going to give a very condensed synopsis of what you're going to be hearing tonight as opposed to what the meeting notice is, otherwise it would take up half the meeting. As documented in his recordings, Henri Temianka, 1906 to 1992, was one of the finest violinists of the 20th century. Born in Greenock, Scotland, of immigrant Polish-Jewish parents, he studied violin with Carol Blitz in Rotterdam, Willy Hess in Berlin, Jules Boucherit, okay, thank you, in Paris, and finally Carl Flesch at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. In 1930, Temianka was in Curtis's first graduating class, earning a double degree in violin and conducting, having studied the latter with Artur Rodzinski. As a violinist, he was further influenced by Eugène Ysaüe, Jacques, Thibaud, and Bronisław Huberman. Flesch referred to him as possessing both musically and technically a model collection of talents. The program will feature rare live and commercial recordings of Temianka throughout his long career, as restored by the presenter, demonstrating a musical sophistication, technical command, and virtuoso technique achieved by very few violinists of any era. John H. Haley is an audio restoration engineer and proprietor of Harmony Restorations, LLC, as well as an ARSC member of many years, who has served as editor of the sound recording review section of the ARSC Journal since fall of 2012. He is a retired commercial attorney with a lifelong interest in both classical and popular music, holding a Bachelor of Music degree from the University of North Texas with concentration in voice and piano. While in college, he served as a professional chorister for the Dallas Civic Opera. Since 1987, he has served as a board member of the Bel Canto Institute, www.belcantoist.org, an organization that teaches bel canto opera style to young singers every July in Florence, Italy, and serving as president of the board since 2005. Without any further ado, and any more preparation, here is John Haley, which is promising to be a very, very interesting evening. John, all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Seth. So I don't have to read all of that now. Please pick up, you'll see in the handouts, you'll have the bio that Seth was just summarizing, plus a couple of short articles that I gave you. One of them is a 3.5-page article about the Franco-Belgian school, of which Temianka is certainly an exponent, and he explains what that means and who the people were and how he was influenced. And then there's a very short 2-page beginning of a long article that I just put the 2 pages about the importance of tone production. And that seems simplistic, but it's actually words of great wisdom that I wish every violinist would read. And you'll hear tonight, he certainly lived by that. It was his unfailingly beautiful tone in everything he played. That was always important. The first record, I'm going to try to talk less and play more. The first record is the rarest of all Temianka records. It's so rare that it no longer exists. Through a long story I'm not going to relate, the record is lost. It's gone. It was an acetate record. I think it was a 10-inch. I never actually saw it myself. And it preserves all that we have of a 1934 performance of the London Proms conducted by Sir Henry Wood. And it's only an excerpt of the third movement. I think that was all that was recorded. It was obviously recorded off the radio. Thankfully, a fairly bad copy of it was kept before it got lost, and that I restored that as well as I could. It starts sounding really terrible, and then it gets a little better. But it's only 3 minutes worth, so I'm going to put you through that, and I promise everything else on the program will sound good. But it shows you very interesting things about his playing. It's interesting also he's playing Wieniawski, because the following year, in 1935, he placed third in a very famous violin competition, the Wieniawski competition. At that competition, Jeanette Neveu took first place, and then was followed in second place by David Oistrakh. Third place was Temianka. Temianka and Oistrakh formed a lifelong friendship thereafter. Neveu, of course, died in a plane crash in 1953, so her career was cut short. She was another Flesch student, as was Temianka. So let's hear, just bear with me and put up with a few minutes of very sketchy sound, and then it'll get a little better. Okay. That's all we get. But you can hear what a virtuoso he was at that point in his life. He was establishing a solo career as a solo violinist in Europe. That sort of ended when he came to the United States before World War II. But at that point, in 1934, it was before his 28th birthday. So he was already before the public about 5 years as a concert violinist at that point. The next one, we're going to skip to more Wieniawski, but this time an excellent sounding record. This is another very rare record. It exists only in one copy. It's a test pressing. It's mislabeled. It has only the words Wieniawski Romance on it, which it's the second movement of the same concerto, often excerpted as a solo piece under the title Romance. It's Romanza in the score. Here we have him with orchestra. We don't know who the orchestra is. It's likely he's conducting it, which we can sort of tell from listening. But we don't have any other recordings of him with orchestra in this period, so we can't even guess. It's 1949 or 1950. It's best we can figure that out. So at this point, he is still playing the Paganini Strad, which we'll talk about more in a minute. He used it for solo work as well as the quartet. When he founded the Paganini Quartet in 1946, it lasted for 20 years. During that entire period, he used the fine Strat instrument that Paganini had used for a concert instrument, for his own concert instrument. So that's the instrument we're hearing. So guess that, number 2. I think that's a particularly good example of how to play that kind of music. We don't hear it played with that much sensitivity, that much expression, that much feeling and actual meaning that we don't often hear it. We hear that piece a lot, but we don't hear it very often played with that kind of affinity for the style. I'm going to jump around a little bit here. We're moving forward. After the Paganini Quartet, after too many personnel changes that wore Temianka out, ended in 1966, and the four-strat instruments went back to the Corcoran Gallery, which had inherited them at that point from the will of the lady who owned them, that bought them, Miss Clark. At that point, Temianka, from that point forward, he acquired an instrument that became his main concert instrument for the rest of his life. It was kind of a fluky instrument. It was a Michelangelo Bergonzi. Michelangelo, sometimes called Michelangelo, was the son of Carlo Bergonzi, famous maker who had been an assistant to Strad and Stradivari. And the Carlo Bergonzi instruments are very, very desirable for concert violinists. There are plenty of violinists who would be just as happy to have a Carlo Bergonzi as a Strad for their concert instrument. This, of course, is made by the son, but we don't, because there's some funniness about the date on the label, it might actually be comprised of parts that were made by Carlo after he died. But at any rate, it's a wonderful, wonderful instrument, and we will hear it throughout most of the rest of the program. It's sort of a Maria Callas violin. It has a very powerful G string, kind of a deep chest voice, if you will, for a rather silvery violin. So the next piece, we're skipping forward. After Temianka lived in Los Angeles, and after the Paganini Quartet ended, he founded the California Chamber Symphony, which was his orchestra, and conducted it for decades thereafter, also giving chamber concerts and playing solo with his orchestra and also occasionally concertizing around the world. So we have a good many wonderful tapes. The one I want to play next, I don't have the exact date with me. It's from the late 1960s. It's with the Bergonzi violin that I mentioned, and it's with the most famous student of Carl Flesch, Henrik Schering. They played the Bach double concerto together. We're going to hear the third movement. It's a live performance with the California Chamber Symphony, conducted by Temianka as well as playing the violin. So you might want to turn this one up. Let's see. Schering generally played a powerful Guarneri violin, which we think he's playing there. He rarely played it below mezzo forte, as he did there, so that's what we're hearing. Seth was fact-checking me in real time a minute ago. Jeanette Neveu died in a plane crash in 1949, 1953. My apologies, so thank you, Seth. That's right. You're absolutely right about that. Sorry to mislead anybody. Another Bach piece coming up. Moving forward, Temianka was fortunate to play very, very well into old age. He was still playing very well in his 80s, and we're going to hear some later things. But right now, we're going to move forward to 1977. Our violinist by now is 71 years old, still playing fabulously. He gave a concert where he played all 6 of the Bach violin and keyboard sonatas with famous harpsichordist and organist Anthony Newman, who was less famous then, became very famous now, and is one of the grand old men of organists. He's still with us, still active, and so he was involved in this. I restored this recording. He was involved in that too. I have plans to release it again in high def before very long. But this is from a live concert, 1977 at UCLA with Newman, and we're going to hear the Adagio ma non tanto movement from Violin Sonata number 3. Now, this is one may get loud. moving back in time, in the early 70s, Temianka made a number of commercial recordings for a West Coast label called Orion. Every one of those records I've ever heard is kind of badly recorded. They've done him no favors at all with those records, despite the musically beautiful performances. But we're fortunate to have a master tape that comes from that and a copy of another master tape. I'm working right now on high-def releases of both of those. I want to play a selection of one of those tonight, and it features a pianist who's still with us and works only a few blocks from here at Manhattan School. It's Gerald Robbins, who's the professor of piano and chamber music there. I spoke to him. He really wanted to come tonight. He can't because he has teaching obligations tonight. He couldn't get loose. So he was very disappointed, but very, very nice fellow and great pianist. This was recorded, the record was released in 1970. Jerry remembers that it was recorded several years earlier. In 1970, Jerry would have been 24. So if it was recorded earlier, then he was maybe 20 or 21, something like that. We don't know the exact recording date, but at any rate, it's all a recording of all Dvorak violin music, and we're going to hear from the popular four romantic pieces, which you hear somewhat, although they had not been recorded when this record was released, but they have been since. We're going to hear the fourth movement, the Larghetto, which is based on basically the whole movement is designed around a three-note theme that's a sort of a weeping, crying theme, and it's a very sad, touching piece. And this is with Gerald Robbins, by the way, with a very, very liquid, beautiful piano playing. So the next piece now, the showpiece for violin, which all violin collectors love, and I do too, I have many records of this, is the Tartini's Devil's Trill Sonata, which is exciting, one of Tartini's most famous pieces, and certainly a very beautiful piece all the way through, and quite difficult to play. The Tartini original exists only as with the violin part accompanied by figured bass. So it's not the accompaniment, it's not even written out. We always hear it these days played in the realization from the figured bass by Fritz Kreisler. And he played it quite straight. He did a regular realization of it, which has no Kreislerisms, no 20th century harmony or any of that. It's a quite serious attempt and very successful. And we generally hear it played on the piano. You can find recordings of it played on the harpsichord together with a cello or a gamba playing the bass line. But in this recording, this is different. Little known fact, Kreisler also orchestrated his own accompaniment. And so we have an orchestration of it. Temianka played it on his concert live. This is a live recording, California Chamber Symphony. It's in the early 70s. I don't have the date right here. But it's interesting to hear his orchestration. It works pretty well. Temianka has put a harpsichord in for piano in the orchestration, which works very well. And the piece is long. It's about 15 minutes. We're going to hear only the last movement. So we'll hear all the Devil's Trills passages plus the Kreisler cadenza, which is famous. I just want to comment, I've never heard anyone play this as easily and beautifully as Temianka does. The Devil's Trills themselves, which are fiendishly hard to play because they're maintaining trills while at the same time playing double stops on the other strings. He doesn't seem to notice that that's difficult. I've never heard anyone play it as easily as he does. And the cadenza basically knocks your socks off. We're going to hear just the last movement. The whole thing is absolutely gorgeous. So, okay. Temianka was also quite a lecturer and storyteller as well as author. He wrote many articles and 2 books, basically memoirs, but they're fascinating reading. But he frequently in concerts would talk about the music. It was a lecture as well as the music, and his audiences loved it. The Los Angeles critics hated it, but that didn't stop him. And so I'm going to let him do some of his own talking here for a minute. We've got, I want to play some Paganini quartet records because it was a very, very special quartet. They, of course, played on the Strad instruments, which had been owned by Paganini. And that quartet of Strad instruments is still together. It's owned by Nippon now. It was most recently paid by the Quartetto di Cremona, very beautifully. They were here just recently. But playing their own instruments. The instruments have gone back to Nippon because they want to put them in the hands of young people, which is amazing. But it's one of the great quartets of Strad instruments. The Smithsonian owns another quartet of Strad instruments. But this is one that had been assembled specifically by Paganini. So all the Paganini quartet recordings are played on those 4 Strads. And we're going to hear them now. But the quartet was active for 20 years and played hundreds of concerts all over the world. But we've had a great deal of trouble finding live recordings of it. There aren't very many. But I have 2 of them for tonight. I want to play one from a lecture on January 7th, 1962, a lecture concert at Royce Hall at UCLA, where Temianka basically explained everything, how we got Western music, basically, in 10 minutes. We're going to play an excerpt of that. Let me set up his lecture. He started by saying that, and I eliminated this for timing, but he started by saying that the original instrument was after the Renaissance, was the human voice, and that people came to events that featured the voice in opera, oratorio, or other pieces, and that a great variety of string instruments were invented, but they were strummed or plucked or bowed, but their purpose was basically to accompany. They were not thought of particularly as melodic instruments. As we know, that changed. And so but he talks about how the idea of human drama, which was portrayed in the stage shows, was carried over into classical forms. And that's what his lecture is about. Let's hear him. I'll let him do some talking.
And then in the 17th century, there was a synthesis, there was a crystallization, in the course of which we ended up with the instruments that we know today, namely primarily the violin, the viola, and the cello, thanks to the marvelous renaissance that took place under such masters as Amati and Guarneri and Stradivari. So by the time Haydn was born in 1732, this marvelous Stradivari on which I play was already 5 years old. The cello, the Stradivari cello on which Mr. Laporte plays, was just about to be born because Stradivari made it in 1736 when he was 92 years old. The Stradivari viola of Mr. Gillis had just been made in 1731. And the violin of Mr. Craig was the Stradivari that had already been made in 1680. So it was an old violin of 52 years when Haydn was born. And later these four wonderful instruments were to become the property of Paganini. Paganini concertized on this instrument. He commissioned the Harold and Italy Symphony of Berlioz for the viola, and he was probably the first one ever to play the late Beethoven quartets at home, including the one which we are going to play for you as the second number this evening. Now, when these wonderful instruments were at the disposal of composers, it suddenly occurred to them that a string instrument wasn't necessarily an accompanying instrument, but that it could also serve in its own right. And so composers began to write music for string instruments by themselves.
That's okay.
And then it became the great historic accomplishment of Joseph Haydn to invent what we call to this day the sonata form, the form that is used in the symphony, in the string quartet, and in the sonata. And Haydn is therefore rightly considered the inventor, the father of the string quartet, the symphony, and the sonata. Now, how did he get this feeling of dramatic conflict? By inventing, in general, two themes, and this is really the basic explanation if one wants to simplify. The basic form of a sonata is that there are two contrasting themes. The one is, so to speak, the male actor, and the other is the feminine lead. And you will see this in the opening of the Haydn quartet, even though there are not really two full-fledged themes, yet the opening one is the lyrical one. And then you will get these contrasts, and this, of course, is the angry male. And oversimplifying a little bit, this is how Haydn and all those who followed after him invented and synthesized dramatic conflict when they were deprived of the actual conflict on the stage. This took care of the first movement, which is the sonata form movement. Then there had to be three other movements, more or less following the pattern of the play in which you have 3 or 4 acts. And since the first act had been the one dramatizing conflict, The second movement had to be the singing one. This is then the slow movement, the cantilena movement. But in Haydn's day, composers did not yet inflict on the listener their deepest personal emotions. This only came about with Beethoven. In general, the themes are lovely, they are ingratiating, but they don't ask you to wallow in agony and despair. For instance, when we come to the second movement, we have this lovely theme. And then Haydn does what became the most popular form of slow movement, a set of variations. Again, the variations don't ask too much of you in the sense of emotional or intellectual participation. In the first variation, the second violin is the soloist. In the second variation, the first violinist is the soloist, and he's expected to show a little more virtuosity, just by the nature of the writing, not in actual fact. Oh, I have skipped the second variation very unjustly. There, the cello is the soloist. The violist is skipped altogether because in those days, the viola player was looked upon as a second-class citizen. The rehabilitation of the violist has only occurred in our day and age. And then Haydn uses another device, which is that in the next variation, the quartet plays as softly as possible. And then, ultimately, one plays as loudly as possible. So you can see how very simple the devices are that Haydn resorts to in order not to fatigue his audience, which consisted primarily of his employer, Prince Esterhazy, and the friends who came to visit him. And then finally, you get, following the minuet, which in the days of Haydn, of course, represented just what the twist represents today in our country. You then have the element of humor, and this was rather shocking to the contemporaries of Haydn. Music had been a very solemn thing, and here suddenly Haydn infuses this kind of element into his music. Really full of levity and very shocking. And when we get to Beethoven, you will again find the enormous development that will have taken place. But let's play our Haydn quartet first.
This is, I'm just going to play one movement. We're going to hear the final movement that you just heard him excerpt. It's the Presto Scherzando. This is Haydn String Quartet in D major, Opus 20, number 4. We're going to hear the players are, of course, Henri Temianka, the second violin, Stefan Krayk, Krayk, violas, Albert Gillis, and the cellist, Lucien Laporte. great advocacy for Haydn. We have that whole recording of the Haydn. They played a late Beethoven quartet on the same program afterwards, and we can't find the tape. So that's all we got of that program. Then I want to shift now to some other wonderful Paganini quartet recordings. This is a live recording they gave at the Library of Congress, Coolidge Auditorium in 1960, so it's 2 years earlier. A piece they played very frequently and recorded it a number of times, the Debussy String Quartet. I think this is the greatest of their recordings, this live one. And it's here we're going to hear the first movement. We have Temianka, we have a different second violinist, Charles Lebove, a different violist, David Schwartz, and again, Lucien Laporte is the cellist. encore to that, I just want to pay the first 3 minutes of the third movement, Andantino. The first movement was entitled Anime et tre Decide, but the third movement is Andantino. We're going to hear the first 3 minutes just because it's very tender, beautiful playing. It's a slow movement. So. We're blessed with a great many very fine quartets in the 20th century, but for me, that's the best one. And they maintained the same quality throughout the personnel changes over the 20 years. They were always wonderful. Let's see, let's go to track 13. We're still in the same venue. We're in the Coolidge Auditorium at Library of Congress. We're going back to 1946, the year when the Paganini Quartet was formed, but we're not hearing the quartet. Temianka played all the Beethoven violin sonatas with a great pianist, Leonard Shure, and I want to excerpt one movement to play. This has been released, but I've doctored this up, the sound on this, I think it make it sound quite a bit better. So play 13, please. Huh? Oh yeah, it's the third movement of Beethoven Violin Sonata number 3. I got another showpiece now for the final selection on the program. This is from a California Chamber Symphony concert on tour in Hong Kong. The date was December 9th, 1980. And if you do the math right quick, Temianka was 74 years old. He's playing Rebelle Zigan with the orchestra. No, that's not it. I'm sorry. 12. Try 12. Yeah. Sorry. I should. There we go. Thank you very much. Anyone have any questions that I might answer? Yeah, Greg. That piece always reminds me more than anything of La Valse. Ravel's funny synthesis of the waltz, that's the funny synthesis of gypsy music.
Obviously, he was one of the great violinists of the century. Why isn't he a household name?
That's a very good question. He had a quite good start on a solo career in Europe. He came here before World War II, for obvious reasons, and he settled in L.A. Shortly thereafter, he formed the Paganini Quartet, which I believe was all-consuming. I think they toured constantly, and every time they had a personnel change, they had to learn all the new repertoire again. And he did play some concertos with orchestra and solo during that period, but he clearly was distracted from pursuing a solo career. I think the other factor that kept him from being among the most famous violinists was that he lived in L.A., and New York was the center of concert activity throughout the time that he was playing. And he also wanted to do his own thing. He wanted to conduct his orchestra, his chamber orchestra, and be his own boss, play what he wanted to do. And I think as he got older, that became a dominant thing. So he did not become a household word, even though, as you can hear, his playing was as great as anyone's. I mean, it just doesn't come any better in my view. He was a great teacher. If you can feel badly that he didn't have more of a solo career, but would we really want to give up the work he did with the Paganini Quartet? I mean, I just barely scratched the surface. Their recordings are stupendous. And we have a complete Beethoven cycle. I will release it, a live one. I'll get that. It has to be a lot of restoration work, but that's the answer in a nutshell. The other thing, the one other smaller factor, the two main critics for the LA Times had a terrible inferiority complex. They absolutely didn't like anything local, ever. And as you heard, his orchestra was a real crackerjack orchestra. They played wonderfully. And they almost never got a good review. There were two main critics there that bombed anybody who was a local West Coast person because they weren't. Martin Bernheimer and Goldberg, I believe is his name. He did. And I've read all the reviews, and I have the tapes, and then I read the review of it, and there's no correlation. I mean, there's really not. They hated the fact that he talked at concerts. That's become very commonplace now, and in general. Yep. Second.
Were you able to track down any notable students?
Sure. He had a lot of students. One of the most famous ones had a blooded career. Eugène Fodor was his, and Fodor got messed up with drugs and ruined his career. He may have studied with Heifetz too. A lot of people studied with a lot of different ones. He had a great number of players were involved in his chamber music concerts in his later years, and many of them are still around. For instance, Cynthia Phelps is principal violinist of the New York Philharmonic. I've got recordings of her playing chamber music with him and the other bunches. So there were a lot of people influenced by his teaching that were not necessarily students, but he did have quite a few students. I'm trying to think of the other ones that became, as you know, a lot of people would study with a number of teachers, and he was among them. So hard to say I can pinpoint that he had one great. And Fodor, I don't think is representative. Fodor was a great violinist, but not necessarily a great musician, as Temianka was. So, but he taught quite a few students. So, yep.
With such tremendous talent, how would he end up on a label like Orion Records versus one of the more notable classical labels of the day?
Yeah, another very good question, and I think the fact that he was on the West Coast answers that question, I believe. Orion was located in L.A. and recorded a lot of artists that were in L.A. There were a great many famous musicians lived in L.A., but they were already world famous before they moved there. Heifetz, Piatigorsky, Premrose, Premrose and Piatigorsky were his very close friends. And many, many other Stravinsky, a lot of famous musicians ended up on the West Coast, but they were already household words before they got there. They didn't develop their careers there. And so, for instance, there's things that I can't explain. That Wieniawski record, the Romance, the test record, that was made for RCA. Why didn't they release that? I mean, that was a great record. You know, they never released. And even the Paganini Quartet, RCA signed them immediately in 1946 to compete with the Budapest Quartet. And they made a number of recordings for RCA for about 5 or 6 years. And we've never figured out they dropped them. We don't know why. They were clearly perfectly good competition. For the Budapest Quartet was fortunate. I mean, it lasted something like 40 years with no personnel changes, which was, well, no, originally it was formed, there were personnel changes, but no, that's wrong. The second violinist was, you're right, was in and out. There were three different second violinists.
Were all Hungarian.
They were.
As we all know, were 3 Russians and a
Well,
Hungarian.
they were Ukrainians actually, but they were, yeah.
Right.
But they were, they had 3 different second violinists.
Oh, yeah.
But the other 3 of them were constant. The other 3 were constant for all of their most famous years, and they lasted longer. So, I think the personnel changes Temianka has written was what wore him out on the quartet. It was just too hard to relearn the entire repertoire every time they had to change somebody, and he couldn't lock them in if they didn't stay, you know. So, but they were all on a very high standard. There's only one bad record. There's a record right before the quartet ended. It's on Everest of the Brahms Piano Quintet with Ralph Vodopek, who's a terrible, terrible choice for that recording. And a lot of things go wrong in that record, but other than that, they're all super duper wonderful records. Yeah. So it's a good question. Why? I mean, careers are funny things, you know. And sometimes it's not everything to do with ability. It has a lot of other factors. I think if he had been in New York, where all the activity was centered, things would have been very different. Anybody else? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Which reminds me, Gregor, what pianist paralleled something like Temianka's career? Wound up in California, also was in oblivion at the end. Egon Patry. Almost the same type of going into... Yeah, but he wound up on a worse label, Eddie Smith's, the Record Corporation of America. Right, but I remember talking to Lee Hoiby, who was one of his students, and he came in one day to teach a class. He said, I just signed up with this Record Corporation of America, and there was someone from Angel who came, and I didn't think the name meant anything, so I didn't sign with them. And they said, you just lost one of the greatest opportunities of your life. That was about 1953. Well, anyway, just to let you know, next month we are not going to be here. We're going to be at the Bruno Walter Auditorium, where I work at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, and I'm going to be co-hosting a program with Ben Modell of something that's very near and dear to me. It's going to be Kovacs on Music, a centennial tribute to TV's original genius. This is going to be given on January 16th, 2020, literally the week before his 101st birthday, so it can still be considered part of the centenary, even if it isn't in 2019. When we send out the notice, there'll be a link for you to, get a ticket to print out. It doesn't cost you anything, but you have to have the ticket in order to come in. And just want to let everybody know, all ARSC New York chapter meetings are free, open to the public. Voluntary contributions to help defray our expenses are welcome and tax deductible. To join ARSC, you can visit the website at www.arsc-audio-org. A good new year to everybody, good holidays, and see you in January downtown. Thanks again.